The internet says there are 91 unlicensed NES games, but I know that's not true. There is one more, and I've seen it. It's real, and at the end of the post I'll show you a picture of it. By then you'll understand why I will never play it, but first the backstory. As you probably know, when the Nintendo released its Nintendo Entertainment System, NES, in North America in 1986, it created a worldwide phenomenon. It had already sold over 2.5 million units in Japan, and the success of the system in America single-handedly revitalized the struggling video game industry. By 1990, 30% of American households actually owned the NES, beating that percentage that owned personal computers by 7%. Mine was one of those households. I remember my dad bringing the NES home for the first time, beaming with pride. I was in complete awe. I remember sitting in our sunken living room and playing Super Mario Bros. For hours upon hours, never sitting too close to the television for fears that my eyes would get damaged. That's what my mom said, at least. And now, what I didn't know then is that making games for the NES was big business. Part of the reason the NES was so successful is because Nintendo actively courted third-party developers for its fledgling system. And because it possessed a near monopoly on the video game market, it was able to enforce its standards and policies with this iron fist. So much so that the United States Department of Justice actually started looking into Nintendo's business practices, and when the FTC gets involved, Nintendo changed some of the strictest terms of its agreement. Now, by Nintendo's official count, there are 671 licensed games for the NES. That list grows to 677 if you include the 3 Tengen games that were only temporarily licensed, plus several others like Miracle Piano, which were left off of Nintendo's list. To enforce its licensing standards, Nintendo created the 10 NES authentication chip. When the chip in the system detected the chip in the game pack, the game would then be playable, otherwise, no dice. As you can imagine, many companies either didn't want to pay the licensing fees or were rejected as officially licensed partners by Nintendo's based on the quality of their game. Hence the 91 unlicensed games. You can see the list of them here. To skirt the protection of the 10 NES chip, some companies configured their hardware to create a several millisecond voltage spike that short-circuited the authentication chip for just a moment and allowed the game to be played. Interesting stuff, right? I thought so. And so did my dad. He worked for Nintendo in their development and licensing department during the late 80s and early 90s and got to experience all of this as it happened. But the story of Ladder to Oblivion does not begin with my dad, and it begins with Rob, the founder and original president of LTO LLC, and his idea for a new video game. Rob was in his senior year at West Lafayette High School in Indiana when Mario Bros. Was released for the NES. Like thousands of other kids around the country, he became obsessed pretty quickly. When Rob graduated, he decided to attend Purdue University to study computer science. He wanted to make video games, and Purdue's computer science department moved to a newly renovated building in the fall of 1985, and Rob took full advantage of it when he started college the next year. 4 years later, he graduated at the top of his class, with honors. My dad told me Rob was one of the smartest people that he had ever personally met. Though even so, Rob dealt with some personal demons. His mother raised him alone after his father was murdered in a home invasion when he was young. His mother was home when it happened, but her life was spared. The resulting trauma sent her careening through years of alcoholism and depression. Rob was neglected, and as you can imagine, eventually went into the custody of Child Protective Services. He acted out at first, but eventually rose above the shitty hand that he had been dealt, and when Mario Bros. Came out of the senior year, he had found it to be the escape he'd been seeking. My dad told me the story about the day he first met Rob a dozen times, May 25th, 1992. You remember the date because the Friday prior was Johnny Carson's final Tonight Show, and Jay Leno had announced as the new host that Monday. Johnny wanted Letterman to replace him, he said every time, not that Leno fella. That Monday, he was sitting at the desk when the phone rang. The voice on the other side hesitated for a moment. "How do you like to be rich?" the man said. And my dad had heard a version of that question 100 times and typically hung the phone up immediately when he heard it. This time was different, though. Something in the man's voice intrigued him. My dad said he'd love to. "And do you have a secret to winning the lottery?" The man didn't laugh, but instead said, "I've got something much better." "And what's that?" my dad had shot back. A new type of game, one the world has never seen. And my dad continued on, saying that he was just listening. Rob introduced himself as the president of LTO LLC, a game company. At the time, my dad had no idea Rob was the only member. Rob went on to describe the game he was working on. It was a platform game where the main character moved across the screen from left to right, collected items and power-ups, and fought enemies. At the end of each level, there would be a boss, with an ultimate boss at the end of the game. My dad explained that Nintendo already had a game like that, and it was called Mario Brothers. My dad said Rob told him the differences were in the details. The game would start with a young man who finds a strange wooden ladder protruding out of the ground. When he climbs down the ladder, he realizes he can't go back up again. The only way is forward. At the end of each level, the young man must fight a demon who appears in the form of someone from his past. It could be a teacher, a parent, or a friend. But the player would find out that it was always someone who had harmed the main character in the past. After defeating the demon, the player climbs down to the next level. There would be 9 total levels. The screen would become darker and the enemies more powerful, and by the 9th level, Rob explained the player would just barely be able to see his way through the darkness. At the very end, the ultimate boss would appear. The player finally learns who he's been fighting to reach the entire time, which would be a mirror image of themselves. Defeating the boss reveals a new ladder that leads back up to the surface. My dad asks what happens when the player falls, and Rob says cryptically, "You don't want to know. Can you tell me what it's called?" And Rob almost whispered, "Ladder to Oblivion." Eventually, Rob convinced my dad to meet with him in order to show him the game. It wasn't quite finished yet, but the first 7 levels were playable. My dad told me that he had been mesmerized. The game made me feel like no game had ever before. The bosses at the end of the levels, I started seeing them as the people in my life who had wronged me. A teacher in 4th grade who humiliated me in front of the class, an old high school friend that had stolen my girlfriend. It almost felt like that game changes depending on who actually plays it. When my dad brought the game to Nintendo, they refused to approve LTO LLC as an officially licensed developer. Nintendo, at the time, had very strict rules about the type of content that their partners would include in their game. No nudity, no gore, no cursing, no religious symbols, among others. Ladder to Oblivion's theme and content didn't fall under the recognized restrictions. It was rejected anyways, though, even if it was allowed and everything. The only explanation that was given at the time was that it was just too dark. Rob was crushed, my dad had said, understandably, obviously, working on a game and then getting that. He'd worked on Ladder to Oblivion for the better part of about 3 years. My dad told me the day of the final rejection was the last time he'd ever spoken to Rob, never saw him again, begged him several times to try and get in touch with Rob. Maybe if he still had a copy of the game, we could play it together. My dad said maybe, if he'll dig up his number. And I believe my dad all these years. For all I knew, the story of Ladder to Oblivion, the NES game that never was, ended the day my dad said it did. Yesterday I found out I was wrong. Now it's hard to even type this, but yesterday my dad had committed suicide, and it was a shock to my entire family. He seemed happy, never acted like he was depressed. My mother found him in the woods behind her house, the shotgun used several inches from his outstretched hand. I'm devastated, still am. Last night I went to the one place where I felt closest to my dad, his study. We spent hours in there playing old NES games and reliving his days at Nintendo. On a whim, I ended up grabbing Mario Brothers out of its case. I was only going to play it one final time in honor for my father. When I flipped the door open, I found that there was already a game inside, and my dad never leaves games inside the console. He said it makes them wear out quicker or something like that. The game was Ladder to Oblivion, and the art was just how I pictured it all those years ago. An 8-bit image of a ladder descending into a raging fire. A note was taped on the back. This note contained the real story of Ladder to Oblivion, the NES game that came to be. I considered transcribing the entire thing, but realized I would be disrespectful towards my dad. The note was addressed directly to me. He meant the words within for my eyes only. Plus the words are dark. They aren't even a proper representation of my dad at all. I hope you don't mind that I paraphrase. The day of the rejection, my dad went and saw Rob. He was already obsessed with Ladder to Oblivion. After a lengthy discussion, Rob asked my dad to join LTO LLC as a partner. It was Rob's plan all along, and was the reason he'd asked my dad at the beginning if he wanted to be rich. Together, they'd complete the game, release it as an unlicensed game, and my dad knew all about Nintendo's authentication chip and how to work around it. They both understood that many of these companies have produced unlicensed games like Tengen, Atari Software Branch, and Color Dreams, Bunch Games, Wisdom Tree. They change their names every so often so people would forget how crappy their previous games were. Actually did very well in the market. They knew the risk that Nintendo could come up with a solution that would lock a Ladder to Oblivion out of the NES forever, but, they're willing to take it. Of course, my dad would be a silent partner. He still needed his job at Nintendo. It's what, paid the bills, right? In 7 months, Rob finished Ladder to Oblivion. The two were ecstatic, but their joy would be short-lived. The night Rob completed the game, he called my dad and told him that it was finally finished. My dad was excited beyond measure. The next day, my dad had the game loaded onto 2 pre-production cartridges. He had a friend in the art department whip up a label, complete with Nintendo's seal of quality. That way, they think he was working on something for the company. Once they were ready for a large production run, he'd have them made off-site. No chances taken, right? Rob told him not to play the game yet. He still needed a complete playthrough from start to finish to catch any remaining bugs. My dad agreed reluctantly. Rob agreed to call him when he'd finished so, he could meet my dad and do a playthrough with him. 5 days later, my dad shows up at Rob's house unannounced. Hadn't talked to him since the phone call, and in his paranoia was worried that Rob had decided to release the game on his own and cut my dad out of those profits. What he found was worse. Rob was dead. Now I assume by suicide, but that note is unclear there. There's a lot of rambling at this part about God and the devil, and a lot of sentences that had been scribbled over so heavily that the words were mostly illegible. It looks like Rob left a note. The only words were never climbed the ladder. More scribbled out words. At the end of the page, my dad writes he finally faced himself. My dad moved on undeterred. He was terribly upset at Rob's death, but the game had taken control of his life. Ever since he played it that first time, he said he'd been battling a secret depression too. The only thing he believed would make him happy again was to release Ladder to the public. The very next day, my dad brought on a new partner, a friend from Purdue named Eddie, who was always looking for business opportunities. That night, he played the game. Dad started, ended up leaving after the 7th level to grab some pizza. He returns and finds Eddie dead. Game over, flashing on the screen. Eddie takes the kitchen knife and slashes both of his wrists. The note gets harder and harder to read. But I think he carved something into his arm. UXXYINXXXE. I'm not sure what that means. He says at that point he was convinced the game was responsible for both Rob and Eddie's death, as well as his worsening depression. He tucks the game away, vowing to never play it again. He couldn't bear to get rid of it. I was 5 at the time. I obviously don't remember any of it happening, but I do remember us moving around at the time. My dad quit his job at Nintendo and moved out of town. And for 24 years, my dad kept his promise. He'd never played Ladder all the way through. Until yesterday. I'll include the end of the note here. You can draw your own conclusions. I, for one, believe my dad, no matter what you all might say. Now, my dad never told me what happened to Rob's copy. For all I know, it's still out there. Have you seen it? Now that, ladies and gentlemen, was a story about a secret NES game alleged to have existed called Ladder of Oblivion. Now, as far as I know, the actual facts portrayed over here are pretty darn legit, I would say. As far as I know, the NES has that many sort of licensed games existed, and it's not wrong in saying that a lot of these companies back in the day really did create a lot of unlicensed games like Wisdom Tree and specifically Tengen back in the day. It was a big bustling market, and it was a way for them to protest against Nintendo's lockout chips and Nintendo's actual practices towards forcing games to be a certain way and locking people out of the game production sphere. Now, personally, as far as I know, it's always been this case typically with console manufacturers where when you make a game, you have to license it to them. A little bit of profits, as far as I know, do go through to the actual console manufacturers to make a little bit of money on the games being sold. After all, it is their system that is powering it. And the only place where that is not the case is typically on a freer platform like the PC. When you go through PlayStation, Microsoft, or Nintendo, you do have to, give a little pound of flesh to them for licensing it and for play on the console. And of course, every developer really has to go through it. Back in the day, it was a little bit of a protest for many other developers and larger companies to really fight against Nintendo on this. And of course, it's kind of a topic of debate amongst people, but that's not really the case for the story right now. What it is really focusing on is one specifically unlicensed game created by an individual that was a god tier talented person, good game developer, good video game programmer, good computer programmer, good computer scientist in general, creating a product that would change upon those who had played it. Now, this is one thing where normally I would say that it's against the realm of believability on a technical facet, but I would like to think that because it's an NES game, you tend to give it a lot more imagination than anything else. Back in the days when we used to play games on the Atari, the NES, we would actually have to use our imagination to really, put up what was on the screen versus games nowadays where the graphics are so good that you don't really need to use your imagination. It looks as good as animated movies nowadays, and it's carrying a story where you don't have to have any form of imagination, right? Back in the day, you kind of needed it. So by having generic characters like teachers, police officers, figures of authority, things like that pop up every now and then, it's gonna allow everyone, combining it with the 8-bit graphics, to see them or imagine them in their own likeness. Sort of, if I had a figure that I didn't really like I didn't really like in the past, such as a teacher, and everyone has most likely had a teacher, a figure of authority they didn't like, they would just picture them in the game, and it would have a personal effect to them to a point where, yeah, I can see this kind of changing for every individual, but it's more of a placebo effect, because everyone's going to kind of perceive things a different way. If you give something a story that you fill in yourself through your own volition, then you're going to have that kind of an effect on a game like this. That I will give it defense on. Now, as far as the gameplay is considered, we don't actually see any media regarding it aside from a mock-up of the cassette. So I wish I could see that. I mean, usually for NES creepypastas, it's kind of stuff that you can sort of mock up. But it does take effort, of course, and by no means am I really making that a point that everyone has to do it. It's appreciated when it happens. Regardless, though, by creating a game where you have to go through a basic platformer with, I guess, items, if anything, and with the only gameplay caveat going in the fact that it gets harder and it gets darker to the point where you have to sort of really raise up your gamma levels or your brightness levels on your TV, I assume, to even make anything visible worth a damn, is about it. That's really the only gameplay you're seeing, and that's it. That's all it really is. Now, as far as I can really say, gameplay-wise, realm believability, it didn't do anything that I would put out of it. What it was really going for was an exterior story where we looked at the psychological thriller of this father who was playing a game that caused people to commit suicide. Now, by the end of the note that was given, it seems like this game caused people to go through so much psychological trauma to the point where they really sparked up their depression, and they were witnessing so many of these repressed memories to the point where they wanted to really off themselves. At the end, they didn't want to, but it just made the prospect of it so much more beautiful. You accelerate their depression to the point where killing yourself is the only option possible. Now, I do have to say the concept is interesting, but it really doesn't go anywhere beyond that. I wish we could see more of the game. We didn't. As far as we know, it causes you to kill yourself, but I kind of wish we had seen what the game could have looked like, because I don't believe some standard platformer is going to cause that. But that being said, I think I've really analyzed this more than I had to, and that's all I can really say about it. It's an interesting story with an interesting concept. Everything is believable, but it sort of gives you the concept, but it doesn't really reach out anywhere from it. As far as I can really ask you, what do you think about this? What would you rate it? What would you change to make it better? This has been another episode of Haunted Gaming, part of Creepypastas. If you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. Just like it if you dislike it. Let me know what you think about the ladder to Oblivion. This is me, Mudar, and I am out.